Welcome to Siliconsciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
Hello and welcome to Siliconsciousness. I am your host, David Rothkopf, and this week, as every week, we're going to talk about a variety of important issues in the world of AI. We're really fortunate to have with us this week a guest who is immersed in that world, writing about it on a regular basis. Russell Brandom is the AI editor of TechCrunch and has been covering the tech industry since 2012 with a focus on platform policy and emerging technologies. Thanks for joining us, Russell.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I've been following some of what you've been writing. You write a lot, so I haven't been quite as up to speed as I probably should be. But I'll tell you what really caught my attention, because I'm super interested in, what I would call misconceptions about AI. I live in Washington. We deal heavily with AI and policy. And despite the fact that every day there's a new AI conference here, often several, and you can't listen to anybody in Washington give a talk without their mentioning AI, I get the impression that the level of understanding of what they're talking about is actually decreasing relative to the number of mentions that it's getting. So I'll just take an article you wrote about something rather specific, but it had a paragraph in it that caught my eye. You had an article called "Selling Coffee Beans to Starbucks."
Yeah.
How the AI boom could leave AI's biggest companies behind. And down in it, you had a paragraph near the top, and it said, in short, the competitive landscape of AI is changing in ways that undermine the advantages of the biggest AI labs. Instead of a race for an all-powerful AGI that could match or exceed human abilities across all cognitive tasks, the immediate future looks like a flurry of discrete businesses, software development, enterprise data management, image generation, and so on. And this seemed to me, and you can correct my misapprehensions if I'm wrong, but this seemed to me to really capture everything that frustrates me about this. Because AI is not a monolith. It's not one thing. It's not a moonshot, where you launch a rocket at the moon, you get to the moon, you've achieved your goal. You achieve AGI, it's all that. It's something changing everything. And as it does, it means something different to everything. And so, it doesn't make a lot of sense for everybody to be out there building an AGI when you can take one of the various models that are out there that you find suits your purposes and bolt that on to something that makes AI useful in a specific area. And that's how you go from moonshot to the Industrial Revolution, if you know what I mean. And I'm just wondering, first of all, do you feel where I'm coming at this from? Does that make sense?
I mean, I have a whole sort of long frustration with the sort of DC conversation about AI. It feels like they talk about it, and sort of this is with like the active encouragement of both the federal government wants the conversation to be this way, and the AI companies want the conversation to be this way. They're sort of talking about it as if OpenAI is Lockheed Martin or Boeing, where it's like, you are making goods of intense national security value. You're on our side of the fence, so we're glad that, Lockheed Martin is selling missiles to the American government instead of the Russian government or the Chinese government. And, your success is helping America in its, the American military in its strategic goals. And so that's what we're focused on, is how do we keep the powerful stuff on our team and not let it fall into the hands of the other team, right? And I just don't think that really relates to how AI is actually being used or the nature of the product. Because we're talking about these very sort of, it's software. If you took model weights are like, you could write it down in a book what the model weights are. It's just a bunch of numbers, but it's not like really complex stuff. And I think the big effect that this has is, at this point, almost all of the open source models that are available, and this is sort of, if big companies like OpenAI and Google and Anthropic and XAI and all of those start to really make competitive moves that are causing problems for other people in the industry, the open source models that are the alternative to that are almost entirely Chinese. There are a few open source US competitors that are not really as good. But it's because if you're working on a US model, there's very little incentive to make it open source. And, there's all this money to be had in closing it down. It's certainly what the federal government wants you to do, because if you make it open source, then anyone can use it. And as long as we're treating this like a missile, we don't want anyone to just be using these powerful tools that are being created. But it really has a warping effect on the marketplace. And I don't see the national security benefit whatsoever. I just don't think it makes sense. But I think that's very much like what the DC conversation about AI is.
I think you're right about the DC conversation. My view is that AI is many things, and some of them have a national security application. Most of them don't, and that the U.S. has advantages in some areas, but it's pretty fungible, and other people can pick up on those advantages. I think part of the conversation is that we blur the distinction between subsets of the AI discussion, and at the sort of at crudest, most blunt instrument level, let's just take hardware and software. And so chipsets become this big issue. And of course, even during the Biden administration, which was kind of the first administration where AI was a bigger issue, right? They came up with this idea with regard to China of small yard, high fence. And if we keep them from getting this certain stuff, then we're going to be ahead of China and we're going to win, right? Well, that always seemed like a pretty stupid idea to me, because first of all, China has its own developmental capabilities, and they were already pretty far along the road in that regard. And all these fences are permeable, right? And here we are 3-4 years later, and it looks kind of ridiculous. And in fact,
know about that. I think the one thing that I would just throw in to complicate that story is, I do think Taiwan very smartly looked at what can we do to make ourselves of vital strategic importance to the United States. And and sort of in credit to like their incredible engineering prowess of these Taiwanese companies, like really did put itself at the center of semiconductor manufacturing. The NVIDIA story is more complicated, but and it's sort of separate. But I do think we're now at the point where, even though Trump is sort of trying to open it up, and he said, okay, NVIDIA can sell chips to China if they pay this weird export duty, and
if they're not the super extra special chips.
Even that, I mean, that's sort of what they were trying to do before, and it was a bit of a moving target. Now it's kind of anything goes, but I think at this point, China is looking at that. I mean, China is heavily discouraging their companies from sort of building on top of the NVIDIA stack, because they see that, okay, so now it's opening up a little bit. If the next guy comes in, President Buttigieg is going to close it down again, or President Vance, I mean, who knows? And this is just going to constantly be a headache. And if we're going to succeed long term, we need to build our own infrastructure for the whole stack. So I do think the fence has remained. They were maybe going to have to do this anyway. There are a lot of things that semiconductors are useful for that don't involve AI, even though that's very much the industry focus right now. It's a bit odd. I feel like this is going to take so many turns between now and whenever the world is no longer like organized around the US-China competition that it's very hard to say, like, we're in such early days. It's hard to say if this was a good idea or a bad idea or a success or a failure.
I totally agree. In fact, I had breakfast with somebody this morning and I said, and we were talking about AI in this rough kind of context. And I was saying, the way people look at AI right now, and then they make their projections, it's as if we were at the beginning of the automobile and people were saying, well, because of their automobiles, we know that in the future there's going to be a lot of growth in the need for goggles, dusters, and gloves. Yeah, because that's what you need to drive an automobile, right? And I take this, sort of the most extreme aspect of that. We don't, you wrote an article. I have it here someplace called. No, that's not it. Well, you wrote an article on the money that's going into infrastructure, into the infrastructure competition, right? And there's this big debate. The thing we've got to do is we've got to build up power centers, production, so we can have these giant data centers. And I listen to that and I go, yeah, I understand why they're saying that right now, but we don't know what the models are going to be in 5 to 10 years. So we don't know if all these projections are right or wrong or low or high. And there's a lot of reason to believe they may be high, that people are going to develop more efficient models because they're more efficient. But
yeah, I mean, I do think the efficiency piece is key. And a big thing that's distorting this is, and you see it in that piece about sort of the $1 billion deals, from the very beginning, the companies making AI models, sort of designing the software, have been very closely tied to companies running cloud data center networks and companies making semiconductor, sort of designing high-end semiconductor chips, your NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA recently took a stake in OpenAI, which they're going to pay for with these high-end semiconductors. From the, maybe the first big investment in OpenAI was Microsoft, which was largely paying for it with server time on their enormous cloud network. That's created a dynamic where there isn't a ton of incentive, certainly for the Microsofts and Oracles of the world, to use less server time, right? They see OpenAI creating a lot of demand for processor cycles and the cloud capacity that they are in the business of selling. Well, if OpenAI comes out tomorrow and says, okay, actually, we have this small model now, and it's not as impressive, it's not going to, revolutionize science, but it's actually most of the stuff we do can be done with it, and it only takes 1% of the power as the other model. Oracle stock will go down as a result of that, because suddenly there's less demand for their product. Now, I don't think anything nefarious is going on with this, but I do think you see a real lack of interest in small models and efficiency gains because there's been this race to build that really has defined the industry up till now. The smartest, the biggest, the most powerful model. That's what we're all racing for.
Wait a minute. You don't see anything nefarious in this? I just want to point out the recent activities of the Ellison family, as they have decided, apparently in the past year, and it's actually not, it's the past few years, but that they want to own the media, own politicians in the UK, own politicians in the United States, I saw that, there's this is sort of, I'm a national security guy, so, I see these things, but, there's all this talk of Tony Blair, taking over the Gaza thing, right? Well, the Ellison's put $200 million in the Tony Blair Foundation. I see their footprint everywhere. And if you look at Trump and you look at the people surrounding him, it's Thiel and Andreessen and Ellison and Musk and so on, Bezos, Zuckerberg. You're like, oh, we really are living in the Gilded Age, and here are the robber barons, and they're sitting around, dividing up the spoils. It sounds like that. It's actually worse than that in some respects, but react to what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do think the rise of AI has definitely coincided with a sort of rightward turn of big tech companies and sort of big tech power. There were a lot of people who, I think, felt in the early Obama days, there's a lot of like alignment between Obama and the tech industry, particularly Google. And then they sort of didn't get very much out of it as time went on. Criticism of tech companies became like sharper and sharper. And so you get this odd turn. I think Zuckerberg is a great example, actually, where he is certainly cozying up to the Trump administration. Like, he's presenting himself as a willing partner, and sort of styling himself as a person of the new right. I will say his personal foundation, as he is choosing his philanthropic activities, are a nonprofit to liberalize immigration policy in the United States and for sort of push for criminal justice reform. And I think that's now kind of de-emphasized in his public image. I don't know what's in his heart. I don't know that I want to advise any public Democrats to like go out and try to make friends with Mark Zuckerberg. But I do think there is something transactional about all of this. I also think one of the shifts you see over the same time is tech startups becoming very interested in the defense industry, which had been a little bit déclassé before that. And now we have, as you say, Peter Thiel, Palantir has really, I think, enthusiastically kind of been out in front of supporting the Netanyahu government.
Well, at a certain point, Palantir needs to have sales to match its PE ratio.
I'm not holding my breath on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, it's fine. I do think Palantir is. I was reading. In fact, this person was a short seller. They were shorting Palantir and had put together this dossier of how overvalued Palantir was in the hope that their short position would pay off. But they did make the case that it was the most overvalued company on the New York Stock Exchange, which previously someone would have told you it was Tesla. So I think the idea that being a defense contractor is a lucrative path forward for a startup coming out of this San Francisco scene of sort of Y Combinator, Andreessen, etc., that is fairly new. And these things are so trendy that it kind of, before AI, it was defense. Before defense, it was crypto. You still have companies sort of working their way through these cycles, but there's just a real like block of defense contractor startups bridging those two worlds.
Everything in Washington comes down to some kind of an analogy with elementary school or middle school, and one that's because everybody behaves that way their whole lives. But one of the ones that's been popular for a long time is Pee Wee football, and how everybody crowds around the ball. The interesting thing is that in Washington, what they meant is power and the president, but if you get up to the high level, the president and those closest to him, the ball is actually money, and the people in the valley, these sort of robber barons of the 21st century, they've got the money. On the other hand, for them, it's the scalability, ability to solve regulatory issues, the ability to have a clear path to the growth that they want. And, up until 4 or 5 years ago, they didn't think Washington was going to play a big role in it. 4 or 5 years ago, they started going, there's some things happening there we've got to control. And so Washington became the ball for the guys from the Valley, and the guys from the Valley became the ball for the guys from Washington. And so you've got this kind of thing going on. I don't know. I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting, I don't know that you have a view on it, but at some point, all these Peter Thiels and Andreessens and so forth are going to, unless things really go bad, they're going to have a Democrat as president. And the Democrat's going to go, hey, dude, you picked sides.
I do think, yes, and I would say as a corollary to that, it does not, I would not say necessarily that the Trump or sort of the post-Trump detritus that we're left with after him, again, assuming that he's not just president for the rest of our lives, I don't think they are necessarily going to feel great loyalty to the Peter Thiels and Elon Musks of the world. And so I do think it's one of these examples where a person sort of is drawn into the Trump orbit for fairly short-term thinking reasons, a Rex Tillerson, a Scaramucci, and then is really left kind of in no man's land, where the Trump people hate them because things are chaotic and eventually you sort of exit the orbit. And then everyone else is, well, you put in with Trump against us, so you're also not our friend. I mean, I would say the thing to watch for that has really surprised me and I think made me think that there is more political will to regulate social networks than I've seen kind of ever. After the Kirk shooting, which is obviously terrible, there was a lot of response that was simply social media is a cancer. It's driving people to commit horrible crimes. We need to shut down Facebook. That's the only way to actually address this, right? And this is not something, I would say, one, the critique is much more coherent and specific than what we got with Cambridge Analytica. And two, at the time from Cambridge Analytica, we were not that far from the Arab Spring moment of intense optimism about, we're connecting people and it's a world square and this is a new moment for liberal speech values and things like that. And I don't think anyone really believes that anymore. I mean, even to the extent that people believe it.
We've moved on to a new era where everybody is so exposed to social media and they hate themselves for it. And so, right, everybody can see for themselves, the level that they have an addiction or that this is fucking up their lives. But I do think as these misconceptions about what's going on compound, it does have a business consequence because you don't really know where things are going. I'll give you an example. I mean, at the highest level in the U.S. government, there is in this administration, there is a divide. You have the David Sachs, Peter Thiel, and Andreessen crowd that's controlling AI policy in the White House. Their policy approach is leave us alone. We got this. We don't need any of your darn regulations. You've also got Howard Lutnick, who's never been in the government, and all of a sudden he's like, hey, my power hinges on my ability to give out licenses and let people do stuff and so forth. And so he wants to get involved a little more because that's where he gets a little bit of his upside. So there's a little bit of a divide there. But let's say the edge at the moment is with the Thiel Andreessen, crowd, which I think it is. There is, this phrase that's popular these days, soft secession, right? Where a lot of blue.
I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, well, okay. So it's essentially what it means is we're not going to have a civil war in America. It's just the blue states are just going to pull away a little bit and chart their own course from the government. And when you've got a blue government, the red states do it a little bit more. And so what you end up with is a patchwork of regulatory environments on a host of issues, whether those issues are privacy issues or they're energy issues or they're climate issues or they're disclosure issues, but privacy, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that. I have a friend who's just done a piece, which is going to come out soon, looking at AI power generation and climate across the 50 states. And they're very different policies that are emerging. And at the beginning stage of an industry, obviously investors want to know, how do I scale?
Yeah.
And it's hard to know how you're going to scale if the United States is a regulatory checkerboard. And of course, the world is also a regulatory checkerboard. So this is one moment where understanding the regulatory trends, shifts, frameworks is crucial to understanding, scalability, growth, and who's going to lead, which is crucial to VCs and others making their bets. In dealing with people, does that make sense to you? In dealing with people
I think the number one example I would put for that is SB 53 in California, which basically is sort of the most advanced example of government regulating AI companies. There was a bit of sort of uncertainty about whether Newsom would sign it, but it does now seem like we're going ahead. And it really is going to set the standard for how these companies operate nationally. And it's just a California state law. I would say even before that, if you had things around user privacy, what is Facebook's ability to use my photos that I've uploaded to Facebook to create a face print that can be used to identify me, whether I'm in other pictures that it doesn't have. That was the most aggressive laws on that were sort of Illinois and a few other states had already, but it sort of became through jurisprudence also applied to this, these very strong laws about sort of biometric identification that were resulted in these very aggressive civil suits against, any company with a facial recognition app. I don't think that's like government at its finest, but I do think state laws are we're seeing that just there's more of an appetite at the state level than there is in Congress. And that's also partially why a lot of the pressure from the Trump administration is not just don't do anything, but let's pass a moratorium so states can't do anything.
But when they tried to do that in the big, beautiful bill, then that got cut out of it. But, it's also their leverage in that regard is somewhat limited. And, it becomes complicated further when Europe is going in one direction and China is going in another direction and so forth. And you've got a bunch of that going on right now. Well, I could go on, and I'm really finding the conversation fascinating, and there are a lot of subjects I want to cover, but we're limited in our time here with each one of these episodes. So let me just end with one of these kind of amorphous questions, which you can take in any direction that you want. But you're out there, you're plugged into these people, you're going into all of these meetings. We've got sort of tens of thousands of listeners around the world. And their main question is sort of what's hot, right? What's on people's minds right now? What's the next big thing as people talk? And I don't think it's regulation. I don't think it's some of these things. What are the people that you're talking to right now getting excited by, technologically speaking?
Man, well, technologically, I think it's about agents, which is basically you can think of sort of as multi-step AI models where it does one thing and then it checks back, and then it, if it's going to book me an airline ticket to somewhere or a series of flights, it needs to do one thing and check the price, and then if the price is this, it'll do the next thing. And so that just makes the canvas much bigger for this technology. But I would say agentic AI is sort of the buzzword that people are really focused on.
Yeah, but I mean, to some extent, agentic AI, there is something lurking within it. Um, uh, Not quite to the extent, one of the things about AI that also really bugs me at the moment is that there is this kind of Orwellian 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, crowd out there. It's like all AI is bad, all AI is a threat, right? Or AI will not produce a labor market disruption. Everything's going to be fine. It's just going to create a lot, and it's
So
like,
the labor market question, I think, is really the big one. I think we've seen. So a lot of companies are trying AI. Like there's a general sense, and we saw this. I mean, this is very common with tech trends where, the guy at Ford is like, oh my God, we need an AI strategy. It's the big thing. What are we going to do? Well, we say we're testing this thing. Who knows if they actually use it at scale or anything, right? So I think we're sort of at the moment where those might be scaling up or might not. At the same time, I do think we've seen the people who are looking for impacts of this in the labor market are seeing sort of a decline in entry-level jobs, but that's also sort of because we're headed into a recession anyway. And so that's a bit ambiguous. But I do think the next couple years, particularly if there's just a big contraction in the American economy, we're gonna really start to see how much are companies leaning on this to backfill huge reductions in the workforce that they need to employ, and then also how does that go?
There's another interesting dimension of it, which I find fascinating. During the Industrial Revolution, I know I have gray hair, so you think I would live through it. I didn't. but during the Industrial Revolution, industrialization led to the elimination of labor jobs that were hard labor, physical labor, in agriculture and so on and so forth. And so you could have fewer people doing these hard jobs. This revolution is going to target a lot of white collar jobs. We already know that, one radiologist plus AI is better than a bunch of radiologists.
Maybe. I think actually
maybe.
the radiology question, they've looked at it and the radiologists seem safe for now. I would say one of the big ones is just call center workers, which we don't think of as a big thing or like a pillar in the US economy, certainly. But that's one where it's not really like intellectual intelligence work necessarily. It's a lot of like rote dealing with systems, but it is complex enough that, this is sort of the break that makes that automated.
I was at a World Bank meeting and I was sitting with some ministerial level types and a couple tech types. And one of the Africans said, well, all those call center jobs that were in India, they're coming to Africa. And the tech guy just shook his head. He said, no, they're not. They're coming to AI.
Yeah.
So there are people at the bottom of the pyramid who are going to get screwed. But, what lawyers did in their first 3 years in the law firm, which was basically go to the law library, do research, do this kind of thing. AI is pretty good at that. You don't need as many people doing that kind of stuff as you did once before. And it's going to get better at it as it gets specifically trained in these areas. And that's what I'm getting at, is that there are a bunch of I mean, look, I know people who have lost their jobs in advertising because a bunch of the sort of grunt level first stage creative work was being done by AI. And it wasn't that it was eliminating people. It was just you needed fewer people. And I did have a conversation with an Israeli AI investor, big investor, somebody you would know. And I said, what are you looking for? And he said, oh, I'm looking for the 3-person unicorn. And I was like, well, what's the 3-person unicorn? And he said, well, it's a startup that's a unicorn, but it's using AI smartly, and they don't need a lot of people. So there's only 3 people working in it, but it's going to be big. So there are some senses that it could have essentially an impact on the white collar side of things.
Yeah. I think that is certainly true. And I think a world in which it does not have a significant labor market impact is a world in which AI has failed, basically. And these companies are sort of selling snake oil. I don't believe that's true, but I think certainly it's a possibility looking out in the future. It's going to impact the labor market. And for America specifically, it's coming at an awkward moment in the cycle when there's a lot of macroeconomic need for companies to like downsize anyway. And AI, they're going to look to the hot new technology as a way to fill that gap.
And here's the reality: companies are always looking to do that. They're always looking to save costs.
I mean, yes, I do think there's a level of like, how much did the legal profession need 15 people looking through the things? Well, they were based on billable hours, and so it made sense to build it up. Did it really, was that the best system for doing this work? Well, no, but there was never the political will to really press on it and change things. There was never the economic need to do that. And it's like, well, the pressure's been building up for 30 years, and now there's this technology that's kind of kicking in the door.
There are a bunch of things, there are a bunch of kinds of professions that existed because to do it well, you needed abundant knowledge resources and enough people resources to sort through the knowledge resources to apply them appropriately to your need. That could be a lawyer, it could be a diagnostician, it could be a bunch of other things. And one of the things that we're getting at here is that we're getting better and better at building really, really big databases, sorting through them really quickly, and making some kinds of analyses, that can lead us to the answers we're seeking. But we haven't gotten to the stage, we're kind of at the stage where they're saying, well, I can answer any question you've got. We're not at the stage yet where we know what the question should be. That's still the critical human role in this whole thing, is figuring out what the right question is.
Yeah, I would also say, I don't think we know the best way for humans to interact with these machines. Like, I think in the legal field, we saw a lot of like lawyers get in trouble because they cited cases that didn't exist because they used AI to write the brief. And like, clearly that's not great. Clearly the ideal situation isn't it's going to produce a 20-page document and then the human's going to proofread to make sure it didn't make any mistakes. There's some way to sort of interface human oversight with the sort of raw speed and recall power of these models. But I don't think we know what it is yet, and it may be different for every profession.
Yeah, and also, presumably, the models are going to get better. And we're also going to encounter certain kinds of new problems, unintended consequences. You have the Israelis doing targeting in Gaza using AI. And when they built
yes. Does it seem like they're doing a lot of targeting? Or are they just dropping bombs to eradicate any living thing in an entire square mile?
No, I understand. But in talking to people in the Israeli military, when they were doing this, they said, well, we made a thing that we're going to use this AI to help us do the targeting, and we're going to do it faster, but we will never let AI make the final decision. There will always be a person making the final decision. But what happened was people said, this AI is not bad. And also because their goal was to flatten everything, they didn't really give a shit. And so what they did was AI would punch out a bunch of targets and they'd say, okay, let's do those. In other words, there was over-reliance. And the problem of over-reliance, if you care about the outcome, more than they did, is going to be something that we're going to have to tackle, because there's a tendency of people using these systems to start, letting it fly the plane. And
this is the thing: is we already automating plane flight is like we're already there. It's great. We have the pilot there in case we need to land on the Hudson, but otherwise it's pretty much the machine doing the job.
Right, and I think it's a good analogy. Anyway, look, I've really enjoyed having this conversation.
Yeah, this was fantastic.
And I hope we can coax you to come back and talk to us.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Thanks. And you can follow what Russell's doing at TechCrunch, which I encourage you to follow more broadly. I noticed you. I guess you guys have been around 20 years.
Oh yeah, it's one of the pillars of covering Silicon Valley startups. So all your startup news needs.
And you've worked. We do a bunch of events with MIT Tech Review, and so
yeah, big fan. Yeah, they're fantastic.
They're a great group of people. Anyway, well, we'll have you back. Thank you very much, Russell. Thank you everybody for listening, and join us again each and every week here at Silicon Consciousness. We also do podcasts on AI, climate, and energy, which has grown over the course of the past year, and we really encourage you to join us at that one. Plus, all our other podcasts on politics and national security and all the other stuff we normally do. And so join us at the dsrnetwork.com to get more info on all of that and to support what we're doing if you want to become a member. Until next time, thanks. Bye-bye.